Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, educators all. I am Leslie Ann Samuel, Vice Chair of the Jamaica Diaspora Education Task Force and President of the Union of Jamaican Alumni Associations USA, Inc. I have the honor of serving as your moderator this evening, so a very warm Jamaican welcome to you, whether you're in Jamaica, the United States, the United Kingdom, the Middle East, Ireland, Australia, Japan, and all the places across the globe where we find Jamaica's diaspora. So glad to have you with us. This evening, the Jamaica Diaspora Education Task Force and the Jamaica Middle East Diaspora bring to you a forum entitled Educational Leadership Redefined and Reimagined. With this forum, we also launch our contribution to Jamaica's National Education Week, which I believe begins today through Friday the 7th. It's an opportunity for us to celebrate the important role that education plays in our lives. We choose today to focus on leadership because it is that essential ingredient that is needed at all levels to ensure that our educational system in all its facets is the very best that it can be. In our stride towards excellence in education, we bring you 3 presentations centered on redefining and reimagining what educational leadership needs to be as we look towards a post-pandemic era. Our presenters today are Dr. Miguel Barker, who will discuss Leading with Change, Ms. Judy Villeneuve, who will share with us about educational policy, and Dr. Rohan Jawala, who will focus on leadership inclusivity. To begin our program, it is my pleasure to introduce to you the chair of the JDETF's Education Leadership Committee, Ms. Janine Jackson. Ms. Jackson is a doctoral student in the psychometrics program at Morgan State University. Her master's degree is in curriculum and instruction, and her bachelor's is in English language and literature. She has extensive classroom teaching experience as a certified elementary and secondary education teacher in Maryland and Washington, D.C. public schools. She also spent several years as a lead teacher and data coordinator for several schools in the Abu Dhabi Department of Education and Knowledge in the United Arab Emirates. Janine currently serves as a member of the Outreach Committee for the National Council on Measurement in Education, the International Psychometrics Society, and of course, the director of the Jamaica Diaspora Education Task Force Education Leadership Committee. To share with us an overview and foci of this committee, please join me in welcoming to our forum, Ms. Janine Jackson.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Samuel. Education leadership is the process of enlisting and guiding the talents and energies of teachers, pupils, and parents toward achieving common educational aims. The primary purpose of educational leadership is to ensure academic success through process, material, and training improvements. This is mainly accomplished through collaboration with different individuals, such as educators, parents, students, public policymakers, and the general public. The Education Leadership Committee is here to develop and support current and aspiring school leaders. Although there are a variety of leadership styles, we currently focus on programming and activities that develop 3 specific styles that are already natural to us as Jamaicans and have been shown empirically to influence student learning and achievement. These leadership styles include servant leadership, transformational leadership, and instructional leadership. Servant leadership pushes the ego aside and considers the needs of others. The philosophy behind servant leadership is that a great leader must first serve others, and that this simple fact is central to his or her greatness. True leadership emerges from those whose primary motivation is a desire to help others. Transformational leaders are collaborative and empower their school teams to have a say in the decision-making process and enable collective goal setting. Through role modeling, these leaders create a culture of innovation and improvement and a shared sense of purpose. Transformational leaders instill trust, admiration, loyalty, and respect, which inspires teacher motivation, morale, and performance. Studies have shown that transformational leadership has a direct impact on teacher performance, with teachers willingly taking steps to improve their classroom practice. The findings also show that transformational leadership increases teacher job satisfaction and strengthens their commitment to professional growth, which in turn results in improved student outcomes and lasting progress across the school setting. Finally, instructional leadership involves the practice of planning, evaluation, coordination, and improvement of teaching and learning. Working directly with teachers, instructional leaders evaluate teacher performance and help advance their skills through mentoring and coaching. Our committee also helps with school improvement planning. Before we can dive into leadership development strategies, we have to see what the needs and goals of the school happen to be. As a result, the committee, under the direction of our co-director, Mrs. Norda K. Radigan, has put together a series of Jaminars designed to walk school leaders through the process of completing a school self-evaluation document, including creative and innovative methods for data sourcing and collection. So you see, leadership in education plays an integral role in creating a positive school culture. Education as we know it and have experienced it is evolving, so we must evolve as leaders as well. I am truly looking forward to the panel today to hear their thoughts and perspectives on redefining and reimagining educational leadership. On behalf of the Educational Leadership Committee, I encourage you to join us at our committee meetings, to offer suggestions and requests for programs and activities, and to communicate with the panelists today by using the chat feature. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so very much, Ms. Jackson. We certainly appreciate your contribution to Jamaica via this very, very important task force committee, and look forward to seeing and hearing more from you and your team in the very, very near future. It is now my pleasure to introduce someone who needs no introduction. Born in Kingston, Jamaica, Dr. Dwayne Dice began his educational journey earning a Bachelor's of Education in Education from the Catholic College of Mandeville. He received both a Master of Arts in Educational Leadership and a Master of Education in Teaching and Learning from St. Mary's University of Minnesota, before earning his Doctorate of Education in Leadership and Management from St. Thomas University. Dr. Dice was recently accepted into the renowned Summer Principal Academy program at Columbia University Teachers College, where he will earn a New York State School Building Leadership certification and a Master of Education in Public School Building Leadership in 2022. Dr. Dice has over 15 years of professional experience teaching in K through 6 classrooms and providing instructional training to teachers. Dr. Dice is a published author and also hosts EduTalk and Virtual Storytime on Facebook Live. The chairman of the Jamaica Diaspora Education Task Force. Today, he will share his reflection on our theme, Educational Leadership Redefined and Reimagined. Colleagues, it is my distinct pleasure to give you Dr. Dwayne Dice.
Thank you very much, Miss President, I should say, Madam President of UJA and also Vice Chair of JDTAN and Vice Chair of the Education Task Force. Thank you so much. You wear many hats. All right, so as we get into this, this forum, we want to focus our attention on educational leadership, but it's not just educational leadership. It's educational leadership redefined and reimagined. When we redefine something, we actually take a step back and look at the components of it and see if whatever we have from the past, if it's working, if it's not working, if the definition really makes sense based on the processes. And then we try to come up, or in other words, to evolve a meaning for it again in order to move into the future. And then when we reimagine, we try to think of what it should look like, of what it ought to look like for students and for teachers and for all educational personnel in the systems that we have created, because we create these systems and we can change them. So educational leadership, redefine, reimagine, in a nutshell, is basically looking at policies, looking at engagement, looking at students, our wonderful customers and future leaders, and then change their lives for the better, okay? So let's dive into some of the processes here that we're going to explore. And if you already, for many people who are in viewerland, you have seen the article earlier last week, I think. It talks about educational leadership, redefine, reimagine. These are some of the areas that we want to look at in this about 7 or so minutes that I'm sharing with you. The theories versus practice, power and accountability, adaptive leadership, and teacher quality. And that last one there, it makes perfect sense to put it there because we want to focus on that. What does it mean when we have theories? We have theories just like what Ms. Jackson mentioned earlier, theories in educational leadership to guide educational policies and so on, and the behavior of the leader, and also the behavior of teachers too. The servant leadership, and she went really good into this, where it talks about service. You know, the servant leader is mimic, or it embodies the leadership style of the great teacher. In Christianity, they're referred to as Jesus, where he was sent to serve. So he served the disciples. You know, that's what the servant leadership is, that the leader is not better than the servant. And we're all in this together. All right, so they lead by example. The other one, transactional, is like a business thing where you do something for me and I do something for you. It's very transactional. It's you do something and I do something back. So if you're using that in a school, it's kind of like thinking, okay, how do you measure time in order to pay you for your time in the school? So then we look at emotional leadership. And all of these you actually learn in college. Emotional leadership is not really emotion that you base everything on, the slight emotion. It's basically looking at what motivates people and what triggers their work ethics, and then you find those activities that will enhance their motivation and you put those in place, okay, in the school or any system. The transformational leadership is really where we want to be, where we draw from all the different leadership styles and you put those leadership styles into practice. Now, what does that mean when we look at theory versus practice? The practice is actually putting the theory into action. Leadership, in essence, is about influence and change. If you're not influencing people and you're not making positive change for their lives, then we say that the leadership is not so appropriate, is not good for the organization. So if you want to apply that to the school, if your school leadership, if you as a school leader not influencing change and positive growth, then you really need to, what they say is to check yourself. You need to check it. And there are many different aptitude tests and intelligence or personality trait tests that you can take. Some of them are they're free online that you can take to check basically yourself, your leadership self, and see how you are approaching people. All right, so leadership is about influence and change. Now, educational leadership, and I coined this earlier on last week or the week before, it's not a job. It is not a job. Educational leadership is a way of being. If you think of culture, culture is the way of life of a people. That's what we learn from textbooks. The way of life of a people. That's a culture. Educational leadership is about culture. It is a state of being. It's the way you live and the way you govern an organization. It's not a job. It is action related. And the actions are very much examples. It's the way you live and the way you govern. So that's the way of being. That is educational leadership. So that's the definition of educational leadership, redefined, reimagined. Now let's look at power and accountability. You as an educational leader, you have power. You get power from your office. Whether it, as Dr. Barker would say, the lowest stage in it is leading based on your position. And if you have a position, you lead people and they're scared of you. You don't want to lead people like that. That's the lowest stage of leadership. There are certain levels of power that you have. As a teacher, you have power. As a department head, you have power over the grade level or a few grade levels. As an assistant principal, you have power over curriculum and how it's administered to students. And as the school leader, you have power. So those are levels of power that you need to exercise. But there is accountability. How do you treat people based on the level that you're on? And what sort of relationships you sustain while you're on those levels? Because a teacher will relate to another teacher in a different way than how he or she relates to the other level of leadership. But those relationships are very important. How you communicate up and down the ladder of responsibility and power based on your area of power. So you can dive further into this. Okay, this is just a tip of the iceberg. The relationships that we talk about is based on the school culture. So as an education leader, you want to make sure that the culture is based on respect, mutual respect. And here's another word, trust. It's based on trust. What does trust mean? It is to treat others just as much as you want them to treat you and to talk to you, whether it's a private conversation you're having, or whether you should communicate that to other teachers or students and their parents. You design and develop trust and you sustain that in your organization based on the type of relationships that you have. Now, I put there on the right this little graph here from Stephen Covey. And Stephen Covey is a leadership coach and a very good management leadership writer. Okay, he came up with these quadrants from the book, and if you haven't read this book, you probably need to read it. It's called The 7 Habits of Effective People. It's very popular. And these are the 4 quadrants. And the 4 quadrants talk about time management as a leader or as a leader in a classroom. Is how do you spend your time? How? And what are some of the things that you prioritize? If you look at, let's start with the lowest one, this one down here, to things that you need to avoid doing right now. Okay, this level here, level 3. It is not important, but it is urgent right here. Not important, such as interruptions in your day, phone calls, mails, some emails, you might put there, some meetings, they're not really important, and passing matters. You could leave them alone. They're urgent, but they're not important. And if you want to get them done right now, you can get them done, but they don't take up a lot of your time. Okay. The other one down here that you really need to avoid is this section here in the right lower corner. They're not important and they are not urgent. Those things are not supposed to become a part of your work life. You don't need to take time off to do those things. And these are trivias, busy work, like passing time type of work. You don't need them in your life. So you want to be thinking about some of these things that you have in your circle where they shouldn't become a part of your work life and taking up your time. Okay. Now this is where you want to spend your time. The things that are urgent and important, such as crisis in your organization, in your school, okay, medical emergencies, assigning teachers to a classroom because a couple of them are out, they're sick, or they're taking care of their own personal business, last minute preparations. that you need to get done, deadlines, and so on and so forth. Okay, this area you really need to manage. See the word manage there. Now, this is your focus point here. This will get you very, very far in your leadership development, but they're not urgent right now, but they will get you over the long term. So you're looking at preparation for yourself, long-term planning, okay? Values, setting up values for your organization, school culture, take time to build it, build the school culture over time. The long haul is what it is. They're not urgent, but they're very important. Preparation, okay? True creation and relationship building, as we said, okay? So in a nutshell, these are the things that you need to spend time on, and these are some of the things that you really need to spend too much time on, and you need to avoid. Okay. Okay. The leadership style that I want you guys to think about, okay, and I'm not forcing you to adopt, is the adaptive leadership style. The key components in this are learning to create a learning organizational culture. Okay, what does that mean? It means that you have book study, you have people doing PDs all the time, you have people looking into online platforms that they're learning all the time so that things like the pandemic wouldn't catch up on you. Okay, you have students are actually doing work and it's meaningful work. They're happy doing it. It's not stressful most of the time. It's right there in their sweet spot. You can do this. You don't need money to do this. You can do it. You can introduce a book and one person, you take turns reading the book and sharing from it. You can share teaching strategies. So you become a learning organizational culture. It's a culture that you build over time. You develop people into leaders, other leaders. So you alone are not the only leader in the organization. What does that mean? It doesn't mean that they're taking over your position. It means that on their level, you build their capacity for leadership on their level. So a classroom teacher will feel very motivated to do more work, very, very enthusiastic to come to school and give it their best shot because you believe in them. That's what I mean. Believe in people. You develop them, you give them opportunities. Find out what they like and they dislike. Don't pressure them in the areas that they don't like. Don't pressure them. We have a lot of research on that. Character, know your character. So this is the area where you want to find out who you are in those tests, find out your personality type, find out if you can relate to other people and how you can relate to other people. Find out your personality type. Do the Myers-Briggs test on yourself. There are other personality type tests too that you can do out there to find out who you are so that you can build people and not to tear them down or to attack them the way that you talk to them. Okay, communication is very key to this. And then, of course, change. Prepare for change. Adaptive leadership really is about leading in times of change. So you want to design your leadership style in that manner. Okay, it's difficult sometimes, but you can do it. And the final thing is teacher quality. Teacher quality is #1 priority. What does that mean? It means that when you're recruiting teachers, you need to know exactly who you're asking to work for you. Okay, you need to also, once you get them in your organization, you need to build their capacity. Okay, we talk about professional learning, talk about evaluation systems that they have. Many of the evaluation systems are real. You really need to go back to the table with those evaluation systems and find out the objectivity in them because they're not developing teachers. They're actually tearing them down. So we need to find out how best we can evaluate teachers and help them to perform better. So build capacity. And then look for leadership legacy. Every time we grow as leaders, we have to look at who is coming after us. We need to build that legacy for ourselves and for the people who are coming after us. So this is my take on redefining and reimagining educational leadership. And I hope that you will learn a whole lot this afternoon. I'll be sitting in the back and learning from our great presenters. Can't wait for them to share. Okay, enjoy the presentation and thank you, Ms. Leslie and Samuel. And also thank you to Ms. Carlene Largy, our communications director. You will hear from her in a little while too. And Ms. Tasheka Winter, who is in the background, and I think Miss Kimon Gooden too for technical support. Thank you so much for being on and for doing a wonderful job. And viewers, stay tuned. The best is yet to come right after this. Thank you so much. Enjoy the forum.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Dice. Wow. Leadership is about influence and change. You heard it here. And certainly we are in a time of unprecedented change. Lord knows none of us saw this coming, or maybe there are some that did, but I know I didn't. And so we have to, as Dr. Dice said, we have to adjust. We must change. So I have to say that as you began, Dr. Dice, I found myself thinking of the quote, I think it's from Eisenhower, who said, leadership is the art of getting someone else to do something you want done because he wants to do it. So indeed, you know, we are all leaders in our own right, if only we acknowledge that and step up. So thanks so much again, Dr. Dice, for sharing your reflection and laying the groundwork for our forum this afternoon. It is now my pleasure to introduce to some and reintroduce to others Ms. Carleen Largy. She was born and raised in Kingston, Jamaica, attended Immaculate Conception High School, and even taught primary school for a short time before migrating. She retired after spending 32 successful years in corporate America's banking industry. I know she doesn't look anywhere near that to have spent that many years. We know Carleen. She is the immediate past president of the Union of Jamaican Alumni Associations, USA Inc. or UJA, is currently their corresponding secretary, and is the vice president of her alma mater's Alumni Association's New York chapter. She serves on several organizations' boards and is actively involved in the diaspora community. Carleen is a founding member of the Jamaica Diaspora Education Task Force and serves as our communications director. Ms. Largy will be introducing this afternoon's presenters and assisting us with our Q&A process. Ladies and gentlemen, my pleasure to introduce to you, reintroduce to others, Ms. Carleen Largy.
Thank you, Samuel, and greetings to everyone. I have the great pleasure of introducing, for I think it's about the third time, Dr. Miguel Barker, a gentleman who knows that critical thinking students are powerful learners. This is his 26th year in education with an enviable track record in numerous leadership roles encompassing all aspects of secondary education, both nationally and internationally. He is the proud graduate of Paisley Gardens Teachers College, now known as the College of Agriculture, Science and Education, as well as University of the West Indies in Jamaica and State University, New York, and Wilkes University in the United States. He holds a doctorate in international instruction leadership, where he investigated job satisfaction of middle teachers in international schools. He is currently the chairman of the Jamaica Middle East Diaspora Education Task Force and an ASCD Connected Community Ambassador for the Advancement of International Education, a fellow of the Institute of Mathematics, and a sought-after speaker on the conference circuit. Dr. Barker is currently an assistant principal and MYP coordinator, as is known, for asking the follow-up question always, why do you think that? Even in polite conversations. Dr. Barker is director of Embark Education Limited, a consultancy focused on providing solutions to problems faced by educational institutions. Ladies and gentlemen, here is Dr. Miguel Barker with his presentation, Leading with Change. Dr. Barker. Mute. He's on mute.
Mute yourself. Okay, so, okay, thank you very much, Ms. Largy. You know, it always brings tears to my eyes whenever I hear people somewhat saying introducing me, because I always think of my mother who, invested so much but never lived to see, me reaching certain points in my life. So I always think of her then. So thank you very much for that. Yeah. So, my intention here as Dr. Dice started off this is about trying to talk a little bit about the idea of when we redefine educational leadership and reimagine it, what are some of the things that we need to consider as we do this? And it's very, very important that this is not coming from an expert, so to speak. When I share with you, I don't want it ever to be considered that I speak from the position of an expert. I speak from the position of someone who's on a learning journey. And so as I'm just sharing some of my experiences as a leader, and I'm using conversations similar to this to learn more and more about educational leadership. And in some ways, my presentation is an invitation to you to partake in that conversation as equal partners. So if you have questions and thoughts, and if this makes you think deeply about anything, please feel free to reach out and help me to become a better leader as well as we learn from each other. So while I talk to you today about education, leadership, redefined and reimagined, I'm only coming from the perspective of someone who's saying, I think it needs to be done. And I'm going to share some experience and some readings, particularly some readings that I've had and some learnings that I've had throughout my life. So I really wanted to set the context for that, because sometimes you come to a forum, but if you remember, it's a forum, it's not a research presentation, it's a forum, it's an opportunity for us to talk. It's always important that people understand that. Having said that, I do have, a certain level of experience as I travel the world and I work in different countries. And so some of that will come through as I share my thinking, my understandings, my learnings, and my new, the different thought patterns I'm going through. So you may be wondering, what's this topic that he's going to talk about? It's about leading and sustaining change in school. But really, the topic I want to talk about and what the admonition that I want to put to you is that we should stop eating raw onions. And I know you might be wondering, what is he talking about, But I want you to just imagine the idea of consuming a raw onion. You go to the market and you buy a full onion and you try to bite into that onion and eat it. Now, the reason why I chose this example and this topic is none other than recently I received a video in my WhatsApp communication. Somebody, one of my friends who felt I needed a light chuckle, forwarded a video of a situation that someone shared with them. And the beginning of the situation is a toddler, I think it's a little girl, is in the living room is in the kitchen with her mother. And the little toddler has taken up an onion, and she said to her mom, "Can I have this apple?" So the mom says, "It's not an apple, it's an onion. Can you put it down?" The child then says, "No, it's an apple. Can I have it?" The mom says, "No, I've said before, it's not an apple. It's an onion. Put it down. You should not eat it." The child said, "No, mom, it's an apple." A toddler is like, "It's an apple," and the mom says, "Okay, all right." Because most parents will maybe say, "You know what, all right, it won't kill you. Have a go and let's see what happens." And then maybe you learn something in the process. So it so happens that the video, I have it. Now, first of all, it's not my child. I have nothing to do with it. And I do believe that there's some level of child abuse. So I'm kind of giving a disclaimer, but it's out there in the open. And for me to make the point, you need to see what happens after the child insisted that this was an apple. And the mom says, "Okay, eat it." So just for a brief moment, I want to suspend your sensitivities to toddlers and just watch what happens. Okay, and then we'll talk a little bit more about it.
There's no audio.
Now, why did I find this an interesting video for us to talk about leadership and considering leadership? Now, when I looked at this, I thought, whoa, this is interesting. And then the next thing I started to think about was this child, despite being told many, many times that it is not an apple, decided that, sorry, it was not an apple, decided that it was an apple. Yet when that child finally insisted and bit into that apple, into that onion, and realized it was an onion, she was unwilling to back down. She would rather die eating the onion than just stop and just say, you know what, perhaps this is not the right way to go about it. Now, when I looked at that, I started to think, wow, that's interesting. I wonder if anywhere in my leadership journey, I've come across anyone else who was eating raw onions. I really started to think about that. I started to say, interesting, there must be, I could imagine so many scenarios where I was talking to someone and I saying, it's not working exactly how you say it should. Can we change? And that person was insisting that this is what's going to happen. And I started to think, perhaps they were eating raw onion. So one of the things I invite you to do is kind of think about, different experience where you have leaders, where you have experience working with a leader who was eating raw onions, because it's something to really give you a picture of a scenario where it's not working. We have put this project in place. This project isn't having an impact. You're saying, please, can we just change this one part of it? Or maybe scrap the project, the person, because there's an ego involved. The person is saying, no, not changing it. This is the way it is supposed to go. And they keep making adjustments to make it work. And so one of the things I want you to think about is the idea of whether you have experienced other people eating raw onions. It's an invitation for you to think about that. The second thing I want you to think about is you as a leader. Where have you been eating raw onions yourself? Like, where in your leadership have you been like eating raw onions, like holding on to something because you were the person, you made a decision that this is what it is. Someone says it isn't working in the way that you say. And you as a person, as a developing leader, I certainly, from my own experiences, I also have been eating raw onions as well. And as I said, there are many things that I do really, I really, as a leader, we have to understand that leadership is not a destination. It is a journey. It's the way we get, it's a part of that journey. So we don't get to a point where we're a leader and we're fixed and that's it. It's a lifelong journey. So at all times, we have to be critical of self, and check ourselves. And one of the things when I saw that video, the first thing that came to my mind was, I wonder where I have been eating raw onions, like not willing to accept that this isn't working. And so one of the things I want to share with you, because I said I'm going to be as honest as I can as a leader, is share a little bit about my own raw onion eating experience. And I'll try to be brief, which is not normally my style. When Dr. Dice said to me today, you have half an hour for this presentation, I was like, he doesn't know me, right? And I just deleted 3 slides, so you don't even know what you missed. But I quickly want to tell you one small experience that I had eating raw onion. I say small, but it's a massive one. And it's really something to do with a timetabling issue that we had in our school. And I'm going to summarize it. And I hope I summarize it enough for you to understand it. But the idea is that for years when I worked in my school, we had a timetabling issue. We just could not get the timetable to do some of the things that we felt were important. To be honest, the way that the timetable was created was more focused on what teachers could teach and when they would teach and all that. It wasn't focused on the experience for students. It was more focused on whether teachers could fit into this schedule and that. And there are so many problems trying to get the timetable ready, with every teacher wanting their own thing, and teachers teaching across different school buildings, trying to get them to fit into the timetable. For years, nobody wanted to make a change. The people who were doing it, myself included, we would say, there's nothing we can do. You know, this is the way it is, and let's live with it. And there were teachers who would come in and say, hey, this is not working. Can you change it? And we just, as leaders, would just go, nah, not going to change anything because it's not working. Just about 2 years ago, I realized, you know, that maybe we have been eating raw onions. At the time, I didn't have that conception of it. But I realized that we were eating raw onions because we were just forcing away with something that we weren't enjoying. Can you imagine eating an onion? You know, it's not, we were like dealing with all of the issues and just saying, you know what, we maybe just have to eat this onion. And that's the way it is. Never realizing that we could put it down and admit that something isn't working, and then go find ourselves an apple to continue that analogy. And so over time, we created a different timetable. We shifted the focus of the timetable and started to focus more on the outcomes of the timetable rather than the inputs in the timetable. And we realized that some of the things that teachers were saying were problems with the timetable. Was one, they couldn't find time to plan together. So we said, okay, wonder if we could design a timetable where teachers, the first thing we think about is when teachers would plan. So we shift the focus to the collaborative planning time rather than the teaching time, because collaborative planning time is really more important than even teaching time, because if teachers can get the chance to plan with each other, then their teaching would improve. Many teachers were like, we don't have time to plan. How are we going to teach? So we shifted the focus. As I said, it was a raw onion experience for me. And it took a while for us to put that onion down, stop rubbing our eyes and forcing ourselves to swallow that onion just to prove a point. And so I'm always inviting you as leaders to think about, where in your current job are you keeping things in place? You're eating raw onions. The problems are coming. Maybe your focus needs to shift. And so I want to invite you now to think a little bit now about a redefinition, a reimagining of leadership. And for me, this was an epiphany, the first time I came across this thinking. And it is a thinking that is called systems thinking. And systems thinking is a powerful way of conceptualizing your workplace, really. Because you see, schools in particular are designed in a component format where we have classes and subjects and different year groups. And we tend to think that if one year group is doing all right, if maths is okay, and science is okay, and physics is okay, and this is okay, then the school is okay. But we have worked in many, many schools where everybody is okay, but the school isn't producing anything. You know, we've seen it. You know, everybody is fine. You can't find what's wrong with maths, the kids, and so on. So I wanted to invite you to just indulge me a bit as I share a little bit about a different thinking process called the systems thinking approach to leadership. And it's a different approach because it looks more at not the components of a system, but look at the interactions between the components of the system. And it focuses on optimizing how different parts of the system works together compared to how they work individually. Because there are many people who think that if you make each part of the system better, then the whole system will become better. But that's not necessarily true. A very good example is that, you know, if you take the best parts for, let's say your car, you're driving a Toyota car, and the engine fell out, and you say, okay, you know what, it's a silly engine anyway. I'm going to get the best engine that you can find in the world. And you find the Rolls-Royce, which is considered to be having one of the best engines. Let's say you take that, the best engine in the world, and try to put it in your Toyota. Would it work? It won't. Even though it's the best engine, and it would maybe be the best thing, the parts won't fit, right? The parts won't fit. Your car isn't designed for that type of engine. The connections aren't going to work. And the problem is many, many times as leaders, we think about components and we try to go and watch this new program and we bring it into our school and go, fit it in. It must work. The next thing you realize is that even though it's a great idea, it does not work in your school because your system hasn't been adapted to make that work. And so when I talk about system thinking, I want you to start thinking about systems. A system, as Daniel Ahmed say here, is a set of related components that work together in a particular environment to perform whatever function to require to achieve the system's objective. Now, most times we have problems with schools is because most times we are not very clear on what the objective is. We're thinking that, oh, we'll just do this and then, oh, kids will do their exam and pass. But sometimes the objective is even something more powerful than that. And we need to think deeply about what kind of focus we are in. So I'll share a little bit more about systems thinking. I'll share a few books as well that you should read. Because as I said, I'm just sharing from the perspective of a learner. And I really want to invite you to go and learn more about systems thinking if you're aspiring to get into leadership roles. If you're having problems in your school that keep recurring, if you see a pattern all the time. Now, I'm going to juxtapose systems thinking and what we'd consider to be traditional linear thinking. And many of us may even exhibit traditional linear thinking, very proud of that thinking because it seems logical. It seems like the way to think. So we look at individual parts, but often in isolation. You might say in your school, you know, everything else is fine, but the maths department, we need to fix it. That's the only thing holding us down. But remember, school is a place, and sometimes to fix the maths department, you might need to fix the culture in the school, not maths. Yeah, or to fix the physics department, we might need to fix the way how teachers get the chance to plan, or maybe the location of these, the way how different interactions are happening. But we think, oh, if we just fix one part, that might be okay. So we look at individual. This is considered to be outdated thinking. Businesses aren't thinking like this. And the top educational institutions aren't thinking like this. Top educational systems aren't thinking like this. If you go to Finland, they're not thinking like this. They're not thinking like this. They think the entire education system is interrelated and interconnected. So the decisions about what teachers are paid, what their starting salaries are, what is the qualification, how are they introduced into the system, what age do students begin formal education, how long they spend, what do they study. These are all seen as part of a working system and not as individual parts. If you look at failing systems, you will see they go, that is early childhood and they need to deal with it. This is secondary school and they need to deal with it. And it is separated. And you don't really get a cohesive, coherent conversation that says people understand that this is part of a system. Yet, it will always be referred to as an education system. But it's never one. It's normally components, and people just believe that thinking and looking at individual parts in isolation. Second thing, there's a focus on content, yeah, like knowledge, just knowledge. There's no real deep thinking happening about how the system works. People just trying to know how the input, just the knowledge pieces on it. Cause and effect, you hear people come and say, if we do this, this is going to happen. If we do this, this is going to happen. There's a lot of that linear thinking. And they just go, okay, if we put more money in, if we get rid of that teacher, this is going to happen. If we move this class, this is going to happen. These are the kind of things you'll hear. There's a lot of cause and effect, and there's a kind of approach to fix the symptoms rather than the underlying problems. There's no real focus on the underlying problems. It's, okay, we'll just do this. Okay, we'll just do this. And there are people who are prized for their power to do this kind of firefighting. And they think people are thinking they're doing clever things when perhaps we need to take everything apart and start again from scratch. People tend to think technically about a problem and think that a problem is easily solvable by a simple solution. But schools are complex places. But you hear people speak simply. You hear government ministers speak simply. Your education officers speak simply about this. And you as the person who is in the classroom will say, it doesn't work like that. But it's hard to make that point because guess what? You're trying to make a complex point to someone who is seeing the thing in a linear way. And for them, when you make that point, it doesn't resonate because the thinking isn't there. That kind of system thinking doesn't really exist. Now let's look at this. Let's juxtapose these against what a system thinker would be doing. So the first thing a systems thinker does is look at the whole system rather than individual parts. So the systems thinker will say, okay, you say you have an education system, but what does it produce? For example, you could look at a certain country, look at the literacy rate, and you say, what is the level of literacy in that country? In that sense, the ends justify the means. Then you look at another country where the crime rate is very high, but we talk about this beautiful system. but it is also producing those things. You see, the system cannot just produce, whatever you see is an outcome of the system. And so we need to learn to look at the system as a whole and look at the essential properties of the system. What is it really producing? And then from there, we can decide what are we going to look at when we look at the whole system? Because if you keep the end goal in mind, when you make changes, you will say, how is that end goal? How is that going to contribute to the end goal? We need to focus on processes, not on content. Focus on processes. What processes are going to be implemented? Seek to understand potential causes, yeah, and the dynamic factors that might be at play. Home life, yeah, where they are in terms of even on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, mental ability, mental wellness, you know, classroom factors, traveling, distance traveling. I remember when I was at school, some of us would get up at 4:30, get to school for 8 o'clock. How are you going to learn when, and then you get home at 6 o'clock the next evening and still have home chores? Then people wonder what's going on. We need to create more feedback loops to know what's going on. And then we need to, when you're a systems thinker, you tend to think big picture, including factoring what are the things that are within the system for people to work harder to ensure that the system continues to work. So we need to look at how challenging it might be to work to solve the problem and not just go, it's easy to do this and it's easy to do that. So one of the things I want, when we say we're redefining education and reimagine, if you're a system thinker, you don't look at the situation now and go, well, that's all we can do. You look at the idealized future and say, if I have everything that I wanted, what would it look like? That's the idealized future. And then you start to say, what can we do in the current system to begin to work towards that future? And that's a powerful way of thinking because it's big picture. And sometimes we think that's too hard to do. And people who can't help you solve those problems always tell you, stop thinking about that, just focus on this. But we need to learn the bigger organizations don't think about what is now. Henry Ford did say if he had asked people what they wanted, they would have said they wanted faster horses. They just wouldn't know that they needed to think. I mean, look at what Steve Jobs did with the Apple iPhone. Prior to that, people weren't thinking, in the way that he was thinking about it. So we just need to realize that these things are big picture. What do you want in the idealized future? If you had everything you wanted, what would it look like? And it's a powerful way of thinking when we talk about reimagining educational leadership and when we are thinking about, so we see things happening in our school environment. We see the events. This is what people see. But there are a lot of things that are happening underneath. I don't have time to delve into it, but the way we think about things, the kind of structures we have in place, the things that we keep repeating have a lot to do with the events, but people only see the events, just the events. But we as educators and leaders who are thinking about redefinition and reimagining what's happening have to start looking underneath the iceberg and say, what's causing this? What are we perpetuating? What are we continuing? What do we need to stop doing? Sometimes the best thing you can do is stop doing. I mean, I'm going to be honest. I've worked in 10 years in the UK educational system. I've worked another 9 years in international school system. I still have not written a lesson plan. Because when I'm planning, I do a unit plan. I look at 10, 15 lessons when I used to plan and try to make something meaningful for the learners and not just go lesson by lesson by lesson by lesson. Because it's just not the way that we should be thinking about it. But the point is, events on the outside, we need to look at that. Try and look at the patterns, the structures, the mental models that we use. And that might give us an insight into thinking about systems. Very, very powerful to think about systems. So as I come to the end, because I know Dr. Dice said, hurry up, hurry up, hurry up. As I said, I'm just inviting you to think and go and research and read. Because half of what I speak about is watching videos on YouTube and then implementing them in my practice. Systems thinkers think about interconnectedness. So everything they wonder, how are things connected? How is the math department connected to the physics department? How is it connected to the English department? How is it connected to recess? How is it connected to the time we start school? How are we think about interconnectedness rather than thinking that this is one department, you know? That's what we do all the time. We think, okay, if we just focus on different departments, then we will be fine. But no, we need to look at the interconnectedness, because in the end, you know, if you take a car apart, let's say these are individual parts of the car and you took them apart. If you take them apart, it's not a car anymore. If you take the individual parts of a car and lay them all out, nothing missing, it's not a car anymore. This is the fundamental thing to understand about a system. The car only works when all those parts are connected correctly. And that's when you get the essential property of the system. And each of those parts are specifically selected to address the fundamental property of a car, which is to drive you from A to B. There is no part of the car that can drive you from A to B by itself. It relies on the connections between different parts to move you. So this idea of disconnecting is not something that anyone can even find reflecting in nature. It's prevalent in schools and it's prevalent in maybe government organizations. But if you look at the big industries, the failing ones are disconnected and the ones that are working well are interconnected. We need to move away from this linear way of thinking. Another tool, we need to think circular, feedback loops, learning things and trying it again and testing it and trying it again. We can't believe that when we do it and it goes in one direction, that's it. Okay, I've given the teachers a raise of pay. They should be happy now. We should have seen better results. No, that's not how it works. Silos. Very, very common, the idea of silos, you know, everything in compartment, you know, and everybody's working in their own compartment, the maths department, the physics department. What we need to see is more of this happening, that kind of emergence, because that's where the creativity comes in. When you put the maths department in a meeting with the English teachers and let them work together, you start seeing a different ideas emerging. Stop thinking about parts and think about how those parts fit together to form the whole. But importantly, what do we get? What is the essential property? Everybody loves analyzing, but the biggest problem we make is that we analyze. Analyze means to break apart and think about them as individual parts. Synthesis is putting them together and see what really happens when they are together. So we need to learn to synthesize more. Everybody wants to get an analyst. We need a synthesist, someone who comes in and see how or everything when put together. They spend time in the school, look at the culture, understand the culture, everything at once, a kind of ethnographic approach to it. Synthesis is a powerful tool, more powerful than analysis. The best organizations look at synthesis rather than analysis. But analysis is easy because we think, oh, if we break it apart, it's better. But it's really not something. Isolation rather than relationships. Everybody have their own little staff room. Everybody have their own little corner. No, we need to look at how we create stronger relationships. So these are some of the tools of a system thinker. You can read more and I'll give you the name of someone to check out on YouTube as well. Now, my final slide in this one is one about managing change. So as we think about systems, I want to just leave you with a final thought about a very important piece about change. And sometimes we forget that. And it's about the emotional side of how people react to change. And as we consider change, we need to always realize that our staff always tell us what is happening. And if we're willing to listen more to our staff, we'll know what is wrong with the programs that we're trying to implement. And this is about understanding your staff and building the kind of relationship. Now, the idea about change is this. Change happens if you have a vision, which is really your why. Why are we doing this? If you have the skills, what do we need to do this change? People are trained to do this change. You have incentives, easy wins. People know that this is working. They can see that, you know, you have discussions, you have meetings. People are being recognized for what they're doing, or you can see that you're winning in this change. You have resources, the tools. So skills is like the upskilling the people. Resources, the right tools to implement the change. And we have an action plan, the how. This is all critical. If you have all of these, you'll have success if you try to implement a change. Now, I want to invite you to consider another scenario. What if you try to implement change, but vision is missing? You know what happened? Confusion. People are like, why are we doing this? We have no idea. Even if they have the skills, the incentive, the resources, and the action plan, never ever begin a change process without a clear vision. Because if you don't know what it looks like, the idealized version of it, the finished version of it, then you'll have confusion because no one will know when you're finished. And so you have that confusion and people say, boy, I'm confused and I don't know really what Mr. Barker, Dr. Barker want me to do, because there is no clear vision. That vision isn't shared and agreed and then put into action. It's just ideas. Someone may come in and say, let's do it. And people are like, so why are we doing this? Oh, it looked good. I saw it somewhere. So importantly, confusion is an outcome in people's emotional manifestations if you don't have a vision. What if you have a vision, but they don't have the skill, and but you have incentives in place, resources and action plan? Anxiety. You know what? You're bringing this change. You have a clear vision. Boy, this is going to be the greatest school we can ever have. Here are some incentives. When we get to this point, we will have this at the party, or we'll do this, we'll do that. And here is all the resources. All of you have computers. And here's an action plan. By the 15th of May, we'll do this, that. Teachers don't have the skills. Teachers don't have the skills. You know what's going to happen? Everybody start panic because they start feeling anxious. How are we going to do this if I don't have the skill? Really powerful. Because when you see that anxiety, when you interview your staff and they say, boy, I feel anxious about this, ask yourself, have you equipped them with the skills? Have you provided the professional development, the training for them to be able to take on this change initiative? And that anxiety, that emotional response in staff is a powerful metric for them. They feel pressured. They feel like, it's that anxious because they are speaking about their own self-efficacy in delivering this skill. They're speaking in that language. You're saying, I don't feel efficacious here. I don't feel like I can do it. And so as leaders, we need to think about that, the importance of that. Let's look at another scenario. Let's say we have vision and skills, but incentives missing, or we have resource and action plan. What you're going to see is that the change very, very slow happening because there's no real incentives. People thinking, well, we can take with time on this one. We don't really know what's going on. It's slow. We don't know what's going on. So you get this gradual change. So if it was something we put in to get results of, but we don't see the result, it's slowly happening, or we don't hear that the change is very gradual. But we want change, but we don't want it so gradual that it's snail pace. So think about incentives when you put change in. What about when you have a vision, you train everybody, you give them incentives, you have a super duper action plan, but we don't have the resources. Frustration. Everybody is frustrated because guess what? I'm ready to go, but you never give me the tools. So how am I going to do the job? Frustration. So as a leader, think about this. When people say they're frustrated, what do they mean? Maybe they just don't feel like they have the resources. Oh, you want the results to go up. You want me to teach them how to think in this way. But where's the resource? Where are the resources? And if we don't have that, and government and all that are all guilty of this kind of thing, teachers feel frustrated because you want us to make these big changes, raise the literacy rate, get the results up in maths. But where is the resource? Where are the resources? And the final example is where the action plan is missing. Everybody is happy, everybody clapping hand, everybody high-fiving, great idea. This was one of the best training sessions. I think we're ready to go, but no action plan. Pretty much from day one, this is doomed to fail because nobody knows how to put this into action. Now, the reason why this is important is that as a leader, you're going to come across a lot of these emotional responses. But if you start to listen, if you start to listen to your staff, you're going to start getting a clue as to where the failing might be. And that might give you an opportunity to go and fix it. Like to say, maybe we need to just organize some training. And the key thing though, guys, is when you think about it, always think about all of these when you're putting in a change management process, when you're bringing in change. And that could be anything. We use these big terms, change management, but it's any small tweak in what people are doing. You need to think about that. So you need to, as a leader, deeply consider where you're going to listen. Sometimes we like to talk as leaders. We think if we talk a lot, people believe in it. But we need to listen. And as a leader, you walk around the corridors. I have a philosophy as a school leader that I visit 500 classrooms for the year. Someone say, how you do that? Well, if I visit 3 classrooms a day, which is easy to do for 10 minutes each, it's 15 in a week. In 1 month, I do 60. You tell me how in 1 year I couldn't do 500. Very easy. And I just go in for 10 minutes, walk around, and because I need to listen, not to evaluate, just to hear what's going on. And I see people afterwards want to talk to me. They just ask me, say, how was the lesson? And that's when we talk about the lesson. Not, you don't have to evaluate every time. So the key thing here, you have to learn where to listen. So the other question you ask as we come towards it, is your organization a learning organization? Very important to think about that. And all the things I'm sharing is if you're a system thinker, you have no choice but to be a learning organization as well. So as I close, final piece, consider the challenges you have in your school. What might you change to make the system work better? What could you stop doing? Because sometimes we're just doing things that we don't need to do. Where might you be employing traditional thinking when systems thinkings would serve you better? And more importantly, we need to stop eating raw onions. All right, so Dr. Dice and Ms. Largy, I don't know if I've been over time. I try to be as brief as I can, but I wanted to share that. So as I said, everyone, stop eating raw onions. It's a very important thing that we stop doing. So over to you, and thank you very much for listening, bearing with me.
Thank you so much, Dr. Barker. I don't know that we have time, unfortunately, for Q&A, but Ms. Largy has been posting a bunch of comments, and they have been very, very, very productive and very, very positive in the chat, so that you can look at them as we go forward here. I don't know that any of us will ever look at an onion the same way ever again. Not think about and think about your story, but truly appreciate all that you have shared, especially about the system leadership. I really love the analogies that you used. They make good sense to me. And you know, when things make sense, and they're easy to relate to, then it's so much easier for us to remember them and ultimately apply them. So with that, Dr. Barker, thank you so very much for joining us today and providing that most profound presentation in such wonderful terms that we can all relate to about change. I found myself thinking, I just have to say this about, you know, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting something different to happen. So many people that we encounter. Okay?
Eating raw onions. They're eating raw onions.
Exactly. That's why I thought of it. It's like unbelievable. That is, you know, a raw onion in its true form, for sure. So thank you so much again. Looking forward to some continued partnership between JMed and the JDETF. And thank you again so much for all that you're doing for education as well as for our Jamaica. We appreciate you. Very much. So back to you, Ms. Largy, for our next presenter, please.
Thank you so much. Ms. Judy Villeneuve is a champion for the 1.1 million New York City public school students she works for at the New York City Department of Education. She is currently serving as Director of Policy and Engagement in the Office of the Chief Academic Officer. Ms. Villeneuve previously served as Director of Compliance Services within the Office of the General Counsel, where she led a team to ensure 1,600 public schools met federal and state requirements and chancellor priorities to protect the most vulnerable student population in temporary housing, multilingual learners, and students with disabilities. She has also served as Director of Operational Policy and Research to the Deputy Chancellor of Operations, where she led the citywide implementation of the mayoral school food program, Breakfast in the Classroom, to combat hunger among low-income students and increase their learning outcomes. Ms. Villeneuve was awarded her BA in Communication from New York University and her MA in International Affairs Governance, Rights and Statistics from the Milano School of Policy, Management and Environment with the School of Public Engagement at the New School. She also earned the Leading for Excellence and Equity Certificate from Harvard Graduate School of Education. Education policy being presented by our own Ms. Judy Villeneuve.
Thank you so much, Ms. Largy. It's such a pleasure to be introduced by you. You do a lovely job. Thank you, Dr. Dice, for having me. I really enjoyed your presentation, and Dr. Barker's presentation is a really nice segue into the presentation I'm going to be sharing today about education policy. So it's an aerial view on the components that Dr. Barker was talking about as far as what is being considered, what are the intersecting factors that are considered when we are talking about educational policy. So I'm going to share my screen with you. Okay. Okay, so let's begin by just going over what this presentation is going to cover. We're going to be discussing what is educational policy. Educational policy within educational systems, as well as educational outcomes and available resources. I'm going to share some facts and figures with you, as well as key factors explaining policy dynamics, and then we'll conclude. So let's start with what we have as a definition for education policy. Education policy is a specification of principles and actions related to educational issues which are followed or which should be followed and which are designed to bring about desired goals. Okay, I'm going to share my screen another way. One moment, please. Okay. Okay, I'm wondering what they're seeing now. Can you confirm?
Mhm.
Judy, we're seeing education policy within education systems with some circles and some arrows. That's what we're seeing now as the main screen. And the previous one was off to the side. And now you're muted. You're muted.
Okay, so you should be seeing just the gray screen. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, excellent. All right, so let's continue. All right, great. So, all right, yes. So let's talk about what is educational policy with educational systems. Now, this is something that Dr. Barker kind of touched on. What we want to talk about are what are the factors that come into play when we're talking about educational systems on international and national scales. He spoke very briefly about how the differences apply to, different countries depending on the overall, I guess you could say, approach that they take about education. So there is a dynamic between available resources and differences in policy. And what we have here is when we talk about entire educational systems, we look at specific components that make up the whole. So we have individual participants at the center. We have instructional settings and learning environments. So that's going to be our school systems. Then you have our particular individual schools. Then you have educational institutions and providers of educational services. So when you speak about the government as the, I guess you would say, administrator of resources and who are going to be taking down different policies that filter down to the schools individually, that's where they live. And then, of course, that makes up the entire whole, which we call our educational system. Now, this is actually very important to understand all of these components because we often find ourselves as leaders in schools as taking on a very independent role. There are different leadership mechanisms and requirements as far as leading a staff, but one of the major roles of a principal is that they also have to manage up. And in managing up, they have to take into consideration a lot of these parameters that come down the pike that they have to integrate into their leadership vision. So an excellent example of that, of course, is the pandemic and how resources were strained, as a matter of fact, for having to find different technologies to make available to students at that level. This is something that needed to be in New York City, and I'm sure across many countries and states. They have to make a request not only to the federal government, but also to independent individuals or companies that can provide these types of resources. So being able to navigate those resources is going to impact the policies that are established, and of course, the learning that takes place in the classroom. Okay. So when we look at different economic explanations around educational policy, it goes to very specific ideas around what is considered by the government institution that is managing the educational programs in making their decisions about distribution of resources and policy development. So in this graph, you see you have the key factors explaining policy dynamics are based on inputs. Again, our available resources are grounded in our gross domestic product. So I will show you a graph later that shows the difference between how countries and the priority are how resources are distributed through education. Then you have human capital. How is the human capital being utilized? The type of education that is identified as a priority in a country is based on the contributions that they make towards their gross domestic product. So if you have certain countries that are low in income generation, that are working in service industries or working in different industries that require a lot of manual labor, the priority will be on education in areas where are going to provide them with the resources and the skills to serve that purpose. Because ultimately the education of a country and all of its inhabitants is based on the goal, the vision of that country to realize the global goals for the country's improvement. So as a result of that, or in the flip side, you have countries that have a very high economic income generation and more what they call white collar positions, which require intellectual property. They require knowledge about technical sides of income generation. So the money that is going to be distributed for training in regards to, let's say, technological developments, STEM and things of that nature will be more geared towards those students in that education. And then you have differences in policy, institutional, political, and cultural impacts. Institutional meaning what is the status quo for that country in regards to what they think are priorities for their country's education and for their population. Then you have what is political. We have an excellent example of that in the United States with all of the unfortunate, let's say, fatalities by police that generated a movement that insisted on cultural responsive education in the classroom. It also required a lot of institutions to approach face on the racism that existed in the classroom. So there was a lot of, I guess you could say, culturally sensitive training that took place in different schools and different educational institutions in order to combat those issues. And what we find is, depending on what the political opinion is at the time, it also determines the resources that are distributed. So under Trump, there was a push against these ethnic trainings that were taking place, and money was actually taken from a lot of schools who were participating in this system change through this training about race. Whereas since Biden has come in order to encourage people to go to school, he actually distributed money federally across the country that it requires schools to open at least 4 days a week. So the money comes in and comes out depending on the political opinions and the political movements that are taking place in the federal government. And of course, that has a direct impact on what is taking place in the classroom. And as far as culture goes, culture plays a major part, especially in a country like, let's say, the United States, where you have cultural pockets where that actually impacts how the education is going to be best received. If you have pockets of people who speak certain languages, that's going to impact how that school is going to approach education. So these are the different attributes that we need to keep in mind when we're talking about how is policy developed and what are the priorities. So when we're looking at economic explanations, we look at globalization. That means the movement of people who are coming in and who are coming out of that country. What is the type of education that they bring? Those of you familiar with Canada, they have a very strict policy of admitting people with certain skill sets because they want to add to the GDP by increasing the likelihood of their success and financial generation when they come in. You have international economic competition, of course. We're a global society now. A lot of the work that we do for different countries is done in other countries, and we're competing on an international scale. So that also takes consideration in policy development. Dramatic demographic changes, of course, are taking place as people move for whatever reasons they are moving to either get more opportunities in certain countries, but those are also dictated by limits and immigration, so that also plays a role. Changes in science and technology. We know that we have found that we were technologically behind in a lot of countries, including the United States in certain pockets of the country, and we needed to upgrade the technology, the infrastructure for running Wi-Fi and all of the different technology necessary in order to integrate what is now a lot of online learning, essential to being able to continue to grow our student populations. So you have challenges of societies in transition, of course, takes an impact. All of these are just ideas about what goes into the economic explanations around how resources are distributed. And this becomes the basis on which new educational standards are created. So what are we looking at? We're looking at the growth and diversification of higher education is one of the goals of identifying how we're distributing economic resources. The employability of graduates is a major component. We're not teaching people for the sake of theoretical discussions. We're teaching them so that they can make an impact to improve society. And we also have to look at the shortage of skills in key areas to fill those skills, because again, we're trying to make sure that the society thrives at large. And then there's the expansion of private and transnational education. Okay. So key factors explaining policy dynamics, we have to look at political explanations and institutional explanations. So of course, I've spoken just a little bit about partisan control may affect educational spending levels. So just speaking about the partisan divide in the US government is a good example of that. You have interest groups. They also have a major effect on educational reform. So our interest groups that are interested in making sure that there are culturally responsive education happening in the classroom, there were huge movements that insisted that this was happening. So in the New York City Department of Education in particular, a lot of the curriculum that's been developed is prioritized as making sure that that's achieving the goal of having educational components that speak directly to the cultures of the students that are learning. And this is something that they find, statistically, they learn better, students learn better when they can identify and relate with the information that they've been learning. And we all know that we've memorized a lot of information through our education about other cultures. Dominant post-colonial, countries are, famous for having done that. But the fact is that we can't really identify as well with that education in a way that makes us feel self-realized and where we can see our own potential growth. So for setting our children up for success, making sure that they see that themselves and their future, being able to have a positive outlook on what it is that they can achieve, they do really need to be able to learn about themselves and see other people like themselves achieving these goals. So institutional explanations also include degrees of centralization of political authority. So centralization is an aspect that Dr. Barker did talk about a little bit. The centralized educational components can also seem like silos and operate like silos in a lot of instances. So it's a decentralization to an extent that is necessary that we're trying to achieve in order to be able to collaborate across institutional layers. And I'll be able to explain that a little bit later. So institutionals also take into account the size and complexity of an educational system, because of course, leadership visions are more challenging to be able to implement in larger systems than in smaller systems, for obvious reasons. And then there's the inertia of the educational establishment. That's the idea of just eating the onion over and over again. We have people that are really committed to the way in which education and policies are implemented, regardless of all of the changes that are taking place, that we need to adapt to in order to ensure our success in society. So these are the kinds of considerations that we need to keep in mind and are kept in mind when policies are being generated and revised. Okay. So cultural explanations, we have the importance of public attitudes, of course. That is very important because it's the public that dictates where they put their votes, where they how they're interacting with the community, what they're willing to participate in and what they're not willing to participate in. So education systems were failing to prepare students of color to function in more competitive economic environments for some time with the history you know, that we have. And so a lot of times what we find is now that education has become more accessible to people as we increase internet access, as we increase international collaborations. Now we realize that essential reforms are important to be able to overcome past challenges in regards to better, I guess you could say, distribution of intellectual property and intellectual ability of all people, rather than just those who had more academic or educational standing or financial standing. So with those reforms, we focus on training students to serve more internationalized, high technology, knowledge-based economic systems. So just quickly, of course, the prevailing ideology in the United States was equality and social justice in 1930 to 1980. But as we know, that would have distributed and impacted people differently depending on their ethnic makeup. A lot of people during that time that were people of color or people from countries that were not from European countries may not have felt during that period that equality and social justice were those priorities. But the government's perspective in the United States about how they were approaching education, that was their priority. So shifts in values in industrialized countries relative to education changed, of course, as they needed more people to work in that capacity to increase the GDP. So now there's an idea of freedom and excellence as far as a priority for education in the United States and across the globe in general. Okay, so culturally based educational traditions is something, again, that Dr. Barker had touched on. It's very different in very different countries depending on how they apprehend how education is used to facilitate the needs of their country through being able to empower their citizens. So generally in the UK, the concept that they have and their approach to education is individualism and equality of opportunity. In France, it's collectivism and social equality. So in France, there's a lot of collaboration and group thought around how to ensure that they are directing how the government operates and how money is distributed for education. You have the US, which again, I said is freedom, quality, efficiency, and equity. And we're still working towards achieving all of those goals. And then in Japan, if you're familiar with Asia, Japan is an excellent example of what they identify in education as having a group identity, uniformity, a hierarchy, and a centralization of goals. So influential factors, I'd like to say, are what do we consider in a government to be essential to making our educational decisions based on our cultural norms? So they take into consideration the most desirable kind of knowledge that they believe their inhabitants should be gaining, the best ways of transmitting that knowledge. So that is what happens in the classroom, what resources, what techniques, what theories are being implemented. And then you have the means for deciding who will benefit from that knowledge. Okay, so the means can be a number of things, but the country that is taking that into consideration does make a determination. Meaning what resources are being used, what collaborations are being generated, what are the practices in the classroom, what leadership opportunities are being made for people to be able to teach in those classrooms and lead those schools in a way that is centralized to, or at least in alignment with that government's values. So in conclusion, there is increased recognition that many important features of the development, functioning, and impact of education systems can only be assessed through an understanding of learning outcomes and their relationships to inputs and processes at the level of individuals and institutions. So really what this means is ultimately what comes out of the classroom, how our students perform, is the end goal. We have to take into account that the success has to be based on the success of the student. How are our students faring in relationship to other students that they're comparing with internationally and even locally? How are they performing as far as being able to get work, the work that they're getting to successfully achieve? What are the income changes or differences in what they're being able to produce? Because that feeds back to establishing and maintaining our economic system. So what are we looking at? We're looking at economics, political, institutional, and cultural components, in addition to the policy, educational outcomes, and resources that are used to impact those decisions. So just very quickly, what I want you to see is how Jamaica wasn't in this particular mapping, but we do have countries that are in that you can see that might be similar to Jamaica, and I'll show some Jamaican data later. But this is really showing you across the globe what countries are prioritizing as far as what educational levels they're prioritizing. So the dot at the bottom represents education that is being invested by a country for below upper secondary education, right? Then you have your upper secondary, which is represented by an X, and you have your tertiary, that's representing higher education, university level, college level, and even trade. So I've highlighted just a couple for you to take a look at. So if you go to the far right of this graph, you can see Mexico. So Mexico is investing 60% of their educational outcomes into education that is below upper secondary education. Why? Because in Mexico, it's a low income generating country. They do a lot of manual work, and that is the priority for the country because most of their GDP is coming from manual labor. We're talking farming and things of that nature. And so that is the priority of that country. So you can see that 60% of their population is coming out of or just achieving upper secondary education. You have only 20%, a little above 20% completing their upper secondary education, and a little less than 20% actually achieving tertiary education. So we're going to go all the way to the left side and we're going to look at the Czech Republic. That's very important because the Czech Republic is considered a middle income earning country. It's a former communist country that was under ruled by the Soviet Union, no longer. However, their cultural priorities and in their, I guess you could say, the impact that the country's history has had on equal distribution of resources has also impacted how they distribute their educational priority. So based on that map here, they have practically the highest, they have in fact the highest upper secondary education. So what it means is they're in support positions and technical positions, positions that require some level of education that is formal, right? So we're looking at high school, but we're also looking at maybe just a little bit after high school. And they are providing, I guess you could say, support for corporations and companies that are not doing manual labor. The manual labor, of course, that they're doing for education and upper secondary or just below upper secondary is very low. It's practically 5%. And our tertiary is also not very high. So we don't have a lot of people that have a high school, that has, university level education. And then you have everything in between. The United States is very interesting because we have a lot of people that have, up to 50% that have in fact gotten a tertiary education. But those of you who have grown up in the United States or are familiar with the education system, it's actually very, very expensive. So when you compare it to the education that is being received in the Czech Republic, it's much more expensive than that. So it makes it less easy in the United States to be able to get higher education. And so it's very interesting to see that they're still reaching 50%. A lot of investment goes in education in the United States. Okay, so children out of school. So as students age in Jamaica between 1999 and 2004, the data that our Walden data was able to provide shows that as students actually progress through, the lower school, primary, and move up, that more and more students drop out of school, right? So we have 10,000 students between 1999 and 2004 that were in primary school. So as you move up, you see that, okay, or dropped out of primary school. And then as you move up, you have primary school, then 20,000 are dropping out. And then as you move up, let's go all the way to upper secondary, then we have a situation where it's like 60,000 students are not making it to that level. Now, we know we've made great gains since then, obviously. But the concern is, of course, with the onset of the pandemic and the fact that so many students have now gone online, is how do we get back to the progress that we were making? We don't want to go back to a situation, of course, where our students aren't going to school, but when they physically can't because of, jeopardizing their health, and we're looking at and we're thinking about how do we maintain their intellectual growth and their academic achievement. It's something that I wanted to draw to our attention of where we were, and we've come a long way, and that we want to make sure that we avoid going back to this as much as we can. And so we have a really great example of where we are right now. This is our current data in Jamaica. There is very little difference, as you can see, between the poorest quintile in Jamaica and the richest. In fact, most of 98% of our students enter primary school that are in the poorer quintile, and 100% in the wealthier one. It's only 2% that aren't going. This is exceptional compared to the data that we were looking at previously. Then we have 97 completed primary in the poorer quintile, but in the richer quintile, it's 100%. Again, it's only 3% difference. And then as we continue, you see, of course, that we start to lose ground when we get to lower secondary and upper secondary. Right? So again, we're not that far off from our wealthier counterparts, but it's very important to compare ourselves in our accomplishment to similar countries with similar GDPs. When we look at Belize, we're far exceeding Belize in our ability to be able to provide and sustain our students' educational accomplishment. They start to lose dramatically their poor students when it comes to them completing primary. Only 56% of their students complete primary, bringing it only to 36% that transition into lower secondary, and almost unheard of for them to complete lower secondary school. So when we think about this, we have to like pat ourselves on the back. We're doing an excellent job on being able to more equally train not only our poorest students, but also our richest students practically equally. And then we look at post communist countries like Kazakhstan. They're 100% on both sides, and the cost of education is cheaper, and the priority is higher on completion all the way to the highest level. So it's just important to be able, because this isn't the richest country, they're middle income. So it's important for us to see that we're not far off from this exceptional example that is not the highest performing as far as GDP country. So finally, what are we doing all this for? We're doing this because we want our students to be successful. We want to be able to produce people that can not only get an education, but to sustain themselves and to work in capacities that are going to generate the most income for them, improve their quality of life, and also make it so that they're in a position to be able to contribute to society. And so this gives you an excellent example of when you achieve certain educational attainments, how does that reflect the income that you make and the I guess you could say the impact or the that it has on your likelihood to be able to secure work. So for for individuals that have less than a high school diploma, they're making, on average, a weekly income of $619 in the United States. It goes up as you gradually go up. And as you can see, going up to the doctoral level, of course, it's 18 on average, by the way, people do make more and less, but $1,900 a week. And as you can see, when you look up on the right and you see the employment rate, it's increases or unemployment rate increases depending on how little education you have, because higher education puts you in more demand, right? So we want to make sure that through education, we are using our opportunity as educators to empower our students with the skills that they need in order to be able to move up the ladder of education, making themselves not only more valuable to themselves and their own families, but also to their communities and also to their country and society in ways where it is critical for them to develop the ability to make decisions, to think critically, and to contribute to the improvement of not only their country, their society, and to the lives of everyone that they touch. So I hope you enjoyed this presentation, and I'll be happy to answer questions later about policy.
Well, thank you so very much, Ms. Villanova. Wow. Intellectually, intuitively, we kind of understand the role of policy, and certainly in an area of education. But it's a little daunting, I'm going to say, to look at all of the factors that really have to be taken into account. It's a tremendous, it's an awesome job. Oh my goodness, and those of us who are educators and are in the classroom or are principals, we understand that, but it's an altogether different thing to actually see it as you have shared with us. We unfortunately don't have time for questions, but what I've asked Carleen to do is to actually share both comments as questions in chat for you so that you can take a look. So thank you so very much for that phenomenal presentation. Love the closed captioning at the bottom. Have to talk to you some more about that. So much appreciated. So with that, I turn back over to Ms. Largy to introduce our last but certainly not least presenter, Dr. Jawala.
Thanks again, Leslie Ann. Dr. Rohan Jawala has worked in education for over 20 years and has international experience, having taught in the Caribbean, England, and the USA. He has presented at several international conferences and has had peer-reviewed publications. He has also had a published book and has published several chapters in other books. He continues to develop work for publication and has also been a reviewer for several international journals. Rohan has a passion for addressing topics on online teaching and learning, social justice, inclusion, and diversity, and has presented and written on these topics as well. Rohan Jawala holds a doctorate in education in language and literacy in education from the University of Sheffield in England, a Master of Education in Special Needs and Inclusion Studies from the Open University in England, a Bachelor of Science in Psychology from the Open University of England as well, and a graduate certificate in teaching and learning in higher education from the University of Wolverhampton in England, and a diplomacy in secondary education from Bethlehem Moravian College in Jamaica, and a certificate in social work from the University of the West Indies School of Continuing Studies. He currently works at the University of Central Florida as a senior instructional designer and adjunct faculty. Dr. Jawala will present leadership inclusivity this afternoon.
Thank you, Ms. Largy. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for the invite, Dr. Dice. I join my colleague and colleagues moving forward as we talk about transformational leadership. I do have a few moments. I realize time is moving, so I want us to have a little chat today. I will only try to use 20 minutes. If I do go over about a minute or so, please understand. I want to start off with a short story. It's about a man I came to respect. I use him in my example in my book that I wrote last year because he portrayed a tenant of inclusion. Although he might not have been able to explore or express what inclusion is, he demonstrated that. He is a welder. He was making my burglar bar grills. You call them in Jamaica, or you call them grills, right? And as a matter of fact, he was at my home, fixing up the place as usual, trying to safeguard myself. And I went downtown. And I practically said, you know what? I want to spend a wonderful day when I return from my early days in Montego Bay, just to come back to the hills, to sit under a mango tree, have a Julie mango, eat 2 Jamaican patties, and just relax for the day. So I brought patties up. On my return, I realized that he was there. So I offered him a patty, and I had the patties in the bag. I gave him, and he said to me, I cannot accept that. And I'm saying, you're the first Jamaican guy I've seen not like patties. He said, yes, but I still can't take it. So I pressed him a bit. Because I wanted to know what was the idea about him not taking these patties, right? And he said to me, if I take the patty that you're giving me, it means my workers, those who are working with me, will not have anything to eat. And I was blown away by this, because here was someone not willing to take something to satisfy himself at the expense of others. Now, this was not a one-off for him. As a matter of fact, a few weeks after, I stopped at his workshop and offered him a drink. I was drinking orange juice, of course, and offered him again. And he said to me, sir, you understand, I cannot drink without the others not drinking too. This really reflected a few thoughts on inclusion. And I want us to think about this, because how many times are we able to say, all right, we're not doing this, because if we do an action or we take an action, we are going to be excluding others. We're going to be marginalizing others and possibly discriminating against others in our society. So that brings me to my point where I say to myself, and as I address everyone here today, leaders, and you might not be a leader here today, but I want you to think as inclusion is a movement for transformation, whether you're in leadership or you're a classroom teacher. And as a result of that, I want to share my screen with you at this point in time. And I want us to look at my screen. I'm going to share my screen just to start on. So you should be seeing my main screen. Are you seeing my main screen? Please let me know, because I want to be sharing the correct one.
Yes.
Thank you so much. So I want to present on transforming leadership via inclusive practice. Now, if we look further and I go further into my presentation, I want us to be able to focus on a few things. I want us to reflect on your current status in relation to inclusion. I want us to explore the concept of organizational inclusivity. I want us to examine the promise and the barriers as it relates to inclusion. And I want to allow you to reflect on what is a vision as it relates to inclusion. Now, when I look at it all, I am saying to myself, we are at a time, we are at a moment. We're at a moment when we must consider where we are. COVID came and everyone was helpful and everyone moved along, but we are at a moment that we must consider where we are, that we must consider how we are going to transform ourselves and transform ourselves in such a way that we can help humanity. You know, that is so important. What I always say, and I've said most recently, is that we are here to shape our destiny. And if we are not shaping our destiny within an inclusive framework, then what are we doing? What legacy are we leaving? Because I strongly think that there is no legacy that can take place without you leaving something that's memorable for others to understand. And I think inclusion is a pathway for that. Therefore, for the short time, we want to explore the issue of how can we create that legacy as it relates to our leadership and moving forward. Let us not forget that this time, this moment, and it's a moment, is there to ensure that we reflect and make positive change as it relates to our transformation. We saw that during COVID, we had support from each other. We're still having that support. We saw during COVID that leaders became creative in such a way that they supported each other. And we are indeed stronger together. So as we reflect on the moment, I want us to go further into understanding that this moment is not just an ordinary moment, because this moment is really extraordinary. And as we go forward, we'll understand that this moment has a lot of things that impacts how we will operate within this confine of inclusion. And I want us to take a context within the Jamaican society, because I think that's important. Because when you look at the moment, your moment is going to be affected by your own prejudices within your educational frameworks that you operate in. And, you know, as I thought about this, I thought about uptown versus downtown as it relates to Kingston. And in Kingston, I thought about Canterbury versus Iron Shore in Montego Bay. And I see where we have this sort of discourse where, you know, we have political affiliations that give you that sort of privilege that you have and otherwise creates that sort of prejudice to individuals. So when we look at prejudices, we can see that it can come out of school systems too. As leaders, we have to be aware, because you have private and you have public schools. So therefore we see what is happening. I went to a private school. No, I didn't. I'm just saying that. And someone is saying, no, I didn't. I went to that school and I came out just as good. However, the ideological assumption that I went to a private school sits there well with me if I went to one. Then we have the prejudice that goes on to even university. Oh, I went to that university, and you know, there's a brag about the university you went to. I'm not saying that, but when you start to contextualize the sort of prejudice within a framework that excludes individuals as leaders, we are in a bad cycle. So when we talk about name brand university versus universities that are not name brand, I have an issue with that, because the education that we should encompass is one that could lead to greater innovation as it relates to us. So when we look at our moment is also occupied as leaders, because we need to ensure that we are not creating a sort of injustice to people in our society who are disabled. So we have to think about the moment. I go further into the moment and I think about the issue of religion, because this is a part of the inclusion process. As managers, how do you operate and respect individuals' religious beliefs at the same time while not violating them? And this is important. I will touch on the issue of gender orientation, because in some society that is now a big topic. It is coming to our end in Jamaica. How will we address this? And we know what has happened, because in our moment, we have to understand that political ideologies also shape this movement, because political ideologies have excluded some people and also included some. As a matter of fact, as I thought about this, I thought about some individuals at some point in time are included based on their political affiliation, but after that time, they are not, because their party is not in power. All of this will shape the landscape of inclusion in the land of the Caribbean, in Jamaica, and as well as the Caribbean. So we have to be very careful. So another thing that I thought about the moment, because I think it's important for us to understand the historical connections. The moment is connected, and what you do to make the world a better place by your inclusive practice is also influenced by your histories. And I use the word histories plural because we are come together from different perspectives. And why do I say this? And I want to give you the importance of the historical factor, because as I thought about this, I said to myself, the ancestors fought to survive, And they decided that, you know what, they're going to do something to resist the power of those who were in charge, the white individuals, of course. And they planned a revolt, but someone in the group went to Bakra Master that night and he said, you know, Bakra, they're planning to revolt. They're planning to revolt. And guess what? That was squashed. Because in that moment, someone thought about his own moment, not for his race or anyone, but for the drastic gratification of themselves. So within the moment, we have our selfishness that is also a part of it, and we have to be cognizant of it. So for us to address our moment, it's becoming important for us to address our political ideologies, or association and beliefs as it relates to that, historical connections, experiences, social and cultural upbringing, because that's important, laws that govern our country, and international influence, because that will change our moment and our vision for inclusion as leaders. Because what I could do in Jamaica, and when I'm exported myself out of the country, Dr. Barker and everyone know we cannot go down the line of saying the same thing that we might have said in Jamaica. We have to transform. So within this moment, we have to consider the aspect of what is inclusion. Because if we are to really move our Caribbean and the Jamaican country, we have to consider that inclusion is about creating equal opportunities for individuals within organizations. It's about addressing their own rights to be a person. It's about valuing people. Inclusion requires personal sacrifice. How many of us will sacrifice because we want someone to have the line, that ticket, number 2, and someone else has number 10, but you give away your 2 because that person is elderly? We'll do it, but there are many. So it talks about inclusion is about your own humanity in simple terms, as said before by a few of the panelists. Inclusion or management is important in that way because you treat people with a respect. So as we march on, I'm telling you, the reality is it's not good. It's not good as it relates to inclusion, and I'll give you my feedback on why it's not good, looking good for inclusion. Because the reality is that our system was never designed for inclusive practices. We know that. It was not designed for equality and equal opportunities. We know that, the common entrance and so forth, the streaming of students. And if you realize, if we are to reimagine and move forward, we must understand that an inclusive framework, a national inclusive framework and a policy is needed to be implemented, not just on paper, but in practice, in Jamaica and wherever inclusion is. And you must not be afraid to go against the political status quo or whatever needs to be done, because inclusion requires some level of bravery. You know how brave you are. I'm not saying you're going to stand up and say something and lose your job. Think within your context. Right now, I can see certain things because I'm out of that context. You might not be privileged to say that without having anything, but I want to kind of say what's on my mind today. So I want to look at further at the reality, because we must extend the reality as it relates to the moment. The reality is that, and it's so sad, no country has yet to succeed in constructing a school system that lives up to the ideal of inclusion. Wow, no school. So when a school and an institution says, I'm inclusive, I detest hearing that word. We are inclusive. I think you practice inclusion. You live inclusion. You don't say we are inclusive. We are practicing to be an inclusive organization. It's never ending. It's always hard and difficult. And all countries that have set up policies relating to inclusion, there's always a gap in the practice. And as I stated before, our system was never designed for equality and justice. And to be honest, total inclusion is never possible. And let me also say, I hear people saying, you know, I'm inclusive, the inclusivity, and they use the word so widely they do not understand what it is because they have not gone through the reflection. They have not gone through the process to say where am I as it relates to my own personal beliefs, ideologies, and assumptions They just say, yes, I'm inclusive. Am I inclusive? And I'm going to tell you honestly, I am practicing to be an inclusive person. I just want to make that clear. Now, the dream. I have a dream because I think my dream is a dream for now, because I think it's important for me to have this dream. Because without this dream, I will not be able to move forward. I have a dream when all educators within a system and leaders will be committed to the personal development of all employees. And that is going to take some transformation. I have a dream when education will seek, and the leaders will seek to recruit the most talented individuals within their organization or organizations without giving preferential treatment. I also have a dream when institutions will foster inclusive practices that will also be entrenched in the community based on how they operate. I have a dream that teachers who are going through trauma and need special need and care and accommodation will be accommodated by institutions. And we see where individuals in Jamaica have gone through a lot, teachers have gone through a lot, and our system of support need to be inclusive. Managers need to understand the trauma that has gone on with the spirit, during the spirit for teachers. And I'm going to say this, please don't shoot the messenger. I have a dream when political affiliations will not be a part of the selection process of leaders, and leaders will be selected based on their skills and their ability to transform our educational landscape. I also have a dream when schools will not be a place that will foster a culture of exclusion, but will be able to make the world a better place by teaching inclusive practices throughout. And I want to say that I have a dream when certain ideologies in our society and how it operates and how they discriminate against others will be eradicated, because we know how it operates in Jamaica. I also have a dream, and this is my final one, when inclusion will not reside on a piece of paper, but in action and in our deeds, and will give us a forefront to how we can transform our education system. The road is not easy, because I want to go to the promised land. And the reality is, for this dream, it's a dream, but we must work hard. I'm not going to give up, because it's a work in practice. We should never forget how during COVID, our school leaders advocate for teachers, some of them. I recently saw in Jamaica the sad passing of a colleague, a teacher, and how the Jamaican teachers and the Teacher Association in Jamaica addressed this issue. You know, fellow colleagues demonstrated what true fellowship and friendship was. So we must work harder. The promised land is not going to be easy to attain, but you must join the journey to ensure that teachers also are a part of this journey, from the management level, teachers, and everyone in that school that operates in that way. So how do we get there? How do we become inclusive practicing leaders? We have to develop an awareness of self. Who am I? What are my prejudices? What do I need to advance myself? You have to learn to listen to voices, not just to say, yes, and not take out actions to help the voices move and become meaningful in that organization. We have to create an environment that will nurture talent. So many teachers, sometimes they are in schools and they're so talented, but because of the system that Dr. Barker talked about, they are not engaged. They are not a part of the vision, the mission, and they become excluded. You must reflect on the best practices and make personal changes as it relates to what is needed for inclusion. Reflect on your own practice as an individual. Inclusion does not come by just saying, all right, I'm inclusive. You have to be an ally to others. You have to advocate for others. You have to be an accomplice at times, because that requires you to take actions and to be a part. How many of you will become an accomplice for the inclusion of others in your schools? And we must also endeavor to address the potential issues that can exclude employees within your organization. Now, I want to touch a little bit, I'm wrapping up now, because I think it's important to understand that I use the word watch your talk because it includes, in an inclusive organization, you have to be careful of what you say. You cannot bring outside talk into the classroom because that leads to certain discrimination. And you can see on WhatsApp and all that sort of stuff, you know what's going on. You cannot bring your privilege into your management system and expect individuals to respect you after you're bragging about your latest this and your latest that. You know, I went to school in Jamaica and I remember this girl asking everyone in 7th grade, her first question was when we were meeting and greeting, have you ever traveled? And I'm saying to myself, 26 of us didn't travel and she was the only one that traveled, and she insisted on asking that privileged question, you know. Or you sit down beside someone and they say to you, so how is your day? He said, fine. So where do you work? You work. So what do you do? These are questions of geared to establish privilege and power. So we have to be very careful when you talk about developing an inclusive organization, your media. What do you present to people? What do you share? That can cause you to lose your job, as I've seen in several cases. And be aware that your power and your dominance in that organization can exclude people and must be used wisely to motivate individuals. So the dream and the reality goes on. You have to understand that within your organization, you'll have conflict, and conflict will reduce the level of cohesiveness as it relates to inclusion. Lack of transparency in your organization can limit inclusion. The lack of resources can cause conflict where teachers are even can get physical too if they're not getting what they want, and there's one chair that has a nice cushion and it goes around, that teacher got it and there's can't find it the next day. That can create a big problem. So we have to think about the issue of when we're completing things, to complete it in such a way that we are able to master things and understand let people understand that, listen, the issue of completion of a project is based on everyone working together. And we need to understand that the lack of emotional intelligence is one of the greatest possible dangers as it relates to inclusion. Not being sensitive to individuals, saying things that cause this sort of anger to take place. You know, you have to be very careful. Preferential treatment. Jamaica, you talk about favoritism, you know, curry favor. You went down to custom and you got through because guess what? You were wearing your tie. I'm not saying that, you know, but some individuals are based on that. You, in your organization, you have to be very careful how you take out this preferential treatment. Every day you're calling Mary to your office. Mary, can you do this? What about the other staff? But the bottom line is, for inclusion to take place in an organization, you must understand that it will not take place if there's a lack for humanity. So many people lose their humanity when they go into their management structure, and it is not right. You must remember that people have feelings, people are going through trauma sometimes, people are hurting, but they might not say certain things to you. You must be an advocate, you must understand. So as I go forward, we need to build an inclusive culture. And how can we do this? We can do this by respect, accepting everyone for what they believe in. Develop a sense of belonging. You have the socials around, you invite individuals, let them be a part of the organization, be human again. Create equal opportunity within your organization, fairness. This is all a part of building an inclusive culture. If you want to transform your organization into an inclusive organization and imagine changes that you have never seen before, follow these guidelines. But as I close, I leave with the final questions. And if you answered yes to everyone, I won't say anything because I have a comment, but that is off air. Are you honest and transparent in all your decision-making as a leader? Do you consistently consider the views of all people in your organization that you manage? Have you supported the development of all persons or teachers you supervise currently? Are you able to engage in difficult themes connected to inclusion? Because inclusion is not a nice talk. It's a talk that gets you uncomfortable sometimes. It's a talk that you feel like you don't want to have. Are you providing a framework for the transformation of all students and employees in your organization as it relates to inclusion. And my final one, you know, you put your neck on the block for someone else. Are you willing to advocate for others who are at risk of not being included or at risk of being excluded? If you answered every item yes, I would say to you, have you reflected critically as a leader? And for teachers, other teachers joining, think about these questions, because listen, no man or woman is an island. We work together. Together we are stronger. And remember, we are at our moment, and let's take our moment in making Jamaica and wherever you're working or teaching a better place as it relates to inclusion. Thanks for allowing me this time to present.
Oh my goodness, that was awesome, Dr. Jawala. I think my colleagues would agree with me that we had church this afternoon. You began by asking us to shape our destiny. I found myself taking copious notes and ultimately wrote a note to myself that said, inclusion is like leadership. It's a journey, not a destination. I thank you very much, Dr. Jawala. We have had what has ultimately been some truly world-class presentations today. Those were the exact words of one of our participants today. Her name is Shelley Lee. Indeed, that is exactly what has happened here today. We thought we were talking just about leadership and educational leadership and redefining and reimagining. I think we got a lot more than that today. Dr. Jawala, there are several comments in the chat for you. You will see that folks respect and appreciate you and the passion that you obviously bring to this topic. So we so much appreciate you for taking the time once again to be with us. We so appreciate you. And so with that, ladies and gentlemen, we bring our Education Leadership Redefined and Reimagined to a close. We hope that the information not only achieved the desired impact, but that you too now will truly engage in redefining and reimagining what education leadership means for you as you think about your schools, as you think about your families, as you think about your life. So let me thank once again our phenomenal presenters, Dr. Miguel Barker, Ms. Judy Villeneuve, Dr. Rohan Jawala. Also our leader and presenter, Dr. Dwayne Dice, our Education Leadership Committee Chair, Ms. Janine Jackson, our Communications Director, Ms. Carleen Largy, and our Jamaica Diaspora Task Force Action Network technical team, represented today by Ms. Kimon Gooden and Ms. Tasheka Winter. And to you, our educators, principals, vice principals, senior teachers, guidance counselors, all of you, thank you so much for choosing to be with us this evening and for your commitment to educating our young people, our future. Please join us for some upcoming events. This week on Wednesday, we have the Jamaica Council of Community Colleges and JDTAN with a Teachers Day and Jaminar session. On May 17th through the 21st, Jamaica's Early Childhood Commission and JDTAN will provide their Professional Development Institute. And then a bit in the future, but not so far away, is the JDETF's Education Summit on June 29th through July 1st. There'll be a host of other Jaminars between now and then, so please visit jdtan.org to learn more, or visit JDTAN TV to catch up on some of the events that you may have missed. Thank you all once again for being here. Thanks once again to our presenters and all who had a part of making this a phenomenal evening. Do please continue to stay safe and well.